Let's talk about President Eisenhower, because in the 1950s he was president for the majority of the decade, and so all these peaceful times, and your Cold War efforts, and your technological and medical advances, and your civil rights movements, but also your societal movements and consumerism. Eisenhower was a president during all of that. Eisenhower was a Republican who was very pro business and pro military, as are many Republicans. And he filled his administration with business leaders who had more of a Keynesian economic ideology. So, Alfred Maynard Keynes is a famous British economist who advented the idea of government intervention to inject stimulus into society. So, today, as you see our federal government taking out a $2 trillion stimulus package to stimulate the economy as a reaction to the coronavirus situation, possible unemployment, anything else of the sort, how it affects the economy, it is a Keynesian belief to have the government spend money in a downtime like a recession, spend your way out of the recession, keep things economically afloat, and then when times improve, you recoup your expenditures and maybe even increase taxes or otherwise raise revenue. That's typical Keynesian modeled economics in its most conceptual standpoint. So, this was a very big idea that Eisenhower brought into. It's not socialism. Socialism takes drastic government control over the private sector. Keynesian economics just is an enabler of the government to enable its people to have economic prosperity. You're using the government as one of your vehicles to inject stimulus. That's different than government taking control of everything like in socialism. So don't confuse the two. Otherwise, though, Dwight Eisenhower appointed all kinds of business executives to his offices. Charlie Wilson became the Secretary of Defense. Charlie Wilson was the CEO of General Motors in the 1940s. So you have various different things. One of the things that Eisenhower wanted to do was inject government money to help the economy, but he also wanted to limit the idea of government's actions unto the private sector. He wanted to really let the private sector work its magic. And he promoted the idea of private development and natural resources, farm subsidies, price controls, anything else of the sort. He really wanted to limit that sort of reach and let the market work for itself. What's different than your standard Keynesian economic policy is the idea of spending cuts. Dwight Eisenhower, at one point by 1960, had created a $1 billion government surplus because he had cut so many expenditures. He hadn't quite expanded the welfare state as much as what would be in the next decade. We'll talk about that next chapter. Other than that, though, it's almost unheard of these days to have a government surplus. We're 20 some odd trillion dollars in debt and counting. As a nation, we haven't had a surplus since Bill Clinton was president. Otherwise, though, you have a budget that was cut by Eisenhower, even though you have an increase in government spending. So there's something to that Keynesian theory that's been proven correctly. He did expand the welfare state to an extent. He increased Social Security benefits, so 10 million more people could have that. He had more unemployment compensation. That's going to be pretty interesting in the coronavirus days. The biggest boon to our nation's economy, though, under the Eisenhower presidency was what he did for our interstate highway system. If you've ever driven on 35, or you took 45 down to Houston, or you took I-10 over across Louisiana down to Florida, or maybe you took I-20 out west, or I-40 out west, those interstate systems had to come into place somewhere. The interstate system was developed in the Eisenhower era under the Federal Highway Act in 1956. Massive amounts of money, about $25 billion over a 10-year span back in the 50s money, was invested to create the sophisticated network of highway systems to get people and product across the country in an efficient manner. So you have 40,000 miles that would be built over the course of 10 years and then some that would add to the highway system. So you have interstates like 35, interstates like 10. If you notice their numbers, all interstates that run north and south, like 35 for example, those all have odd numbers. So if an interstate has an odd number, it's running north and south. If it has an even number, it's going to run east and west, like I-10. It runs east and west. I-20, east and west. Okay? That was the idea. You're going to be able to pay for your system by levying a tax on gasoline consumption. Various different, when you buy a car, you're going to have various different taxes you're going to have to pay for. When you fill up your car with gas, every gallon's going to have a certain percentage that'll go towards maintenance of federal roads and otherwise. That's what that's for. That's how you pay for it. You have ready-made consumers who are going to use it. Why don't you make the users actually pay for its maintenance and upkeep? Makes reasonable sense to me. Otherwise, the interstate system is going to have an interesting effect on American society. If you have ever seen the movie Cars, the animated movie, I have two young boys, so I'm very familiar with Cars. The movie takes place in a small mythical town, Radiator Springs, which in its heyday in the 1950s was a booming little town on Route 66. And then the interstate was built, and people could bypass Radiator Springs. They no longer needed to go to Radiator Springs. See, on Route 66, you would drive through every town on Route 66. You would stop on there, you'd stop at the restaurants, you'd gas up, you'd get your tires fixed, you'd get something to eat, you'd have an experience. And the interstate made a lot of that really pointless. And so a lot of towns died because of it. Radiator Springs suffered because of that. And even though it's a fictional story, it tells a true tale of towns that suffered because they were bypassed from the interstate system. Also, interstates had an effect on urban communities as well. Oftentimes, they would serve as a de facto barrier separating one neighborhood from another, i.e., white neighborhoods from ethnic neighborhoods. You have a de facto barrier. And so that, in a sense, creates a different form of unofficial discrimination because you have a barrier. Don't go across that interstate. Don't go across here. That forms a barrier there. Okay? Otherwise, though, Eisenhower's presidency was largely quiet on the surface level. Underneath, things were boiling because you still had McCarthyism in play, trying to identify communists in government systems. You have Senator McCarthy, who even attacked the Secretary of the Army as being a communist sympathizer. And there'd be a whole trial about that. And it would be largely rejected by the American public, which led to the downfall of McCarthyism. But it became a whole idea that communism was still prevalent in our country, but there had to be some sort of norm. There were other people, and I mentioned in the previous chapter about how you had some people who didn't like a passive approach to Truman's containing communism. They wanted to do something about it, take the fight to them. Like John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State at the time, he really wanted to punish communists, and he wanted to push back against Soviet communism. He wanted to retaliate against Soviets and Chinese communists with nuclear threats. Hey, we really want to shove our nuclear arms right in your doorstep. Don't threaten us, communists. That was seen as a little bit too close to nuclear brinksmanship. But otherwise, at the time, that was something that the Americans were still underneath the surface, still fighting against. Nuclear war, containing the threat of communism, pushing back against it. Keep your eye on what's going on in Southeast Asia, because Vietnam in the 1950s had fought a war for its independence against their French colonizers. And in 1954, they won a battle at Dien Bien Phu, which basically trounced a French military force taken over, and soon thereafter, France declared that they were ending their colonialism in Vietnam. Soon thereafter, the country we now know as Vietnam was split in two at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam would be aided by China and the Soviets. South Vietnam would be aided by the United States. Invariably, leaders in Vietnam wanted to re-merge North and South Vietnam. It's just more people lived in the North than in the South. So when a re-election would have theoretically taken place, people who wanted the country to merge and have more of a communist economic ideology, they'd win the election. So the United States decided to intervene a little bit, and even though we weren't sending troops to Vietnam at the time, we were sending political and military advisors in the 1950s to Vietnam so as to thwart the idea of there being communism under a unified Vietnam. Hold that thought. That's next chapter. Subsequently, also going on, you had the creation of the Jewish state in 1948 from the United Nations for Holocaust survivors and people of otherwise Jewish faith and culture could go back to their Holy Land, creating a Zionist state. Modern-day Israel was officially formed in May of 1948 to do just that. And immediately, Arab Palestinians who had occupied the area for many, many years resisted. To this day, there is massive strife. And we'll talk over the course of the next few chapters about strife in the Middle East. But otherwise, that's where it begins.